I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as reports emerge that General Budanov, head of Ukraine's military intelligence, travelled to the embattled frontline city of Pokrovsk, we sit down with former NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, who led the alliance in the first years of the full-scale invasion. We also speak with Norwegian filmmaker Tommy Gulliksen about his powerful new documentary, Facing War, which takes viewers inside the rooms where Stoltenberg and world leaders made pivotal decisions that shape the course of the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 3rd of November, 3 years and 254 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, former NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, and filmmaker Tommy Gulliksen. First, over to Dom for the latest on the military front.
Let's go straight into Pokrovsk in the Donbass. Bottom line up front, very active, very confused. But let's have a dig into it. So, over the weekend, there were reports that General Budanov, General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence department, the HUR, had personally flown into Pokrovsk to take command of the defence or to organise some kind of withdrawal. We're not quite sure what he was there, allegedly there for. No one speculated. It wasn't through official channels that he was said to have been in the area. Images of him in Pokrovsk have been challenged, both the location and the date. I should mention that straight at the top. But photos emerged allegedly showing him in the area and no further details given. There were also claims backed up by unverified footage said to be of members of the HUR, Budanov's command, flown in to the area by Black Hawk helicopter. Oliver Carroll, the Economist's reporter in Ukraine, shared footage but did add the strong caveat that he'd not been able to verify that footage. This footage was supposed to show 11 soldiers being dropped off by a Black Hawk. I'm personally surprised that a helicopter can get anywhere near the area, and also surprised that 11 soldiers can make much of a difference to the defence. So we don't know if it actually happened or if this was part of work on morale. We're not sure, but there are suggestions out there and you'll see footage on social media. Now, Kyiv-based security analyst and friend of the pod, Jimmy Russian, he says that Ukraine only has 3 UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, all currently serving with the HUR. Now, there's also other footage reportedly recorded in Pokrovsk showing soldiers running into a house before coming under a bombardment of drones.
Выход. FPV въебало.
So it does seem to be an incredibly violent, active and chaotic situation there. All very confusing. But it does seem like Russia is camped out on the edges and in many places inside the city from the sort of sector from the southwest through south to east and northeast. Now, speaking to our sources in the area, it sounds like Ukraine is preparing to withdraw forces in good order, which might be what the HUR were sent in to either organise or to help fend off the Russian advance. To allow that, we do not know. But that's what we're hearing and what we're seeing elsewhere. So a mixed bag. But to zoom out for a moment, I'll point you to comments over the weekend by Phillips O'Brien, the Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews University. He offered an analysis over the weekend that was perhaps a little more flippant, but nonetheless accurate about the situation there. So let's zoom out a little bit from Pokrovsk. He said that on August the 1st, 2024, the Russian front line was 16 kilometers, so about 10 miles, from Pokrovsk. He said it would have shamed a snail to move at the pace that the Russian army has moved on the city since then. He says an average snail moves at a normal pace of about 3 inches a minute, about 15 feet, 5 meters an hour. He says a snail starting at the Russian front line on August the 1st, 2024, would have moved more than 31 miles, 47 kilometers, between then and now. The Russian army could only dream of moving as fast as a snail. Now, he carries on. He says what happened, of course, is that defensive firepower mostly, but not exclusively, exemplified by the massive explosion in numbers of drones over the battlefield, have made moving forward an extreme and bloody business. He said, call it a kill zone, a dark zone, a vehicle-free zone, call it what you will, but moving forward can only be done in small increments. Logistics and support cannot be concentrated near the front, and exploitations are impossible. So, as I said, slightly more flippant approach, but it does show the wider picture about the slow Russian advance. But to cap off this bit, it's very confusing what's happening in and around Pokrovsk and whether or not the HUR and General Budanov personally have become involved in the defence or the next phase of whatever the operation is there. Okay, now let's move a little bit further north, and Ukrainian counter-offensives seem to have taken back all of the land in that salient near Dobrapia. So north of Pokrovsk, that lodgement that Russia sort of pushed a few kilometres north a few weeks ago, and then that's been steadily worn down, attrited since then by Ukraine. So they now seem to have taken back all of the land and have kept going. There are reports of Ukrainian forces now taking back ground in the vicinity of Shakove. That's the base of that salient. So sticking still in the Donbass, let's move a little bit further to the northeast. Russian forces attacked near Konstantinivka over the weekend, but the intensity there is said to be waning as Pokrovsk is prioritised and units moved from other areas into the battle for that city. Comments by Ukraine's 11th Army Corps spokesperson Dmitry Zabrazets speaks to that. Now, north again, Russian forces continue their attack near Kupiansk. A very, very serious situation there. Russia's MOD, however, said that Ukrainian forces counterattacked near Velika Shapkivka, that's northwest of Kupiansk. They said Ukraine also counterattacked at Nechvolodivka to the west and Blahodativka, that's to the southwest of Kupiansk. I've seen reports over the weekend suggesting there was movement by Ukrainian forces up to the Oskil River that runs in the area, trying to cut off the sort of finger of Russian forces that have got into Kupiansk itself. So again, another very, very confusing situation there. Those two, Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, seem to be drawing in forces elsewhere up and down the line. Still very violent elsewhere, but no movement for starters, and it does seem as if the major intense fighting and the prioritisation of equipment has gone to those two areas. Now, across the country as a whole, Russian strikes over the weekend by drones, glide bombs and ballistic missiles killed and injured dozens of civilians. 15 killed yesterday alone, mainly in the northeast, east and southeast of the country. Governor Vadim Filashkin said after attacks on energy facilities in Donetsk, he said all of Donetsk Oblast is without power due to enemy strikes on infrastructure. Emergency power outages have begun in the national power grid. There were 5 people killed in his region alone. Ukraine has continued its strikes into Russia, mainly against oil and gas production facilities. Now, on Friday, after we'd been on air, it seems the HUR were active again. They conducted a successful sabotage operation, we are told, against the Koltsovoy oil pipeline just to the southeast of Moscow, said to carry petrol, diesel and aviation fuel. HUR released footage showing a very large blast and quite a neat mushroom cloud rising from the area there. The General Staff of Ukraine said yesterday that they'd also hit the Tuapse oil terminal and its surrounding infrastructure in Krasnodar Krai. That's about 150 kilometres down the Black Sea coast from the Kerch Bridge. Geolocated footage published on Saturday shows fires burning at the port's berth complex and an oil tanker moored at the port. Sources in Ukraine Security Service, the SBU, told Ukrainian outlet Suspilna that the strikes had caused a fire on an oil tanker, disabled 4 of the berths and damaged buildings at the port. Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Captain Dmytro Pletenchuk, a chap we interviewed when we were in Odessa a few months ago, He said at least 3 Russian Shadow Fleet tankers were moored at the Tuapse terminal at the time of the strike, and he said the port accounts for 20% of Russia's crude oil exports. Now, there's footage online that you'll find that shows a lot of tracer fire, as at least one blast is seen at the Deepwater pier and infrastructure. Ombre Intelligence, the maritime risk management firm, they said today that they'd seen post-strike imagery which showed a fire on an offshore loading berth on Pier 1 of the Rosneft oil terminal, with one vessel berth alongside. Video footage of the strike showed the deployment of short-range air defence systems attempting to engage aerial targets, but clearly something got through. There are also unconfirmed reports of other Ukrainian strikes that caused fires at substations in Russia's Kursk and Lipetsk Oblast. So Kursk, that borders Ukraine's Sumy region to the northeast of the country. Lipetsk is the next oblast further northeast from there in Russia. Also, Ukrainian strikes on a thermal power plant in Oryol Oblast. That's the next one north of Kursk. The head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Major Robert Magyar Brovdy, his nickname is Magyar, said yesterday that combined strikes by his units and Ukraine's special ops forces hit 5 substations, including the one in Lipetsk Oblast. Now, Russia's defense ministry said this morning that they had intercepted 64 Ukrainian drones last night, including 29 over Saratov Oblast. That is hundreds of kilometers east of Ukraine. It borders Kazakhstan. Ukraine's general staff said they'd hit the Saratov oil refinery there for the 3rd time in recent months, as well as multiple other Russian military logistics sites overnight, including in Russian-occupied Luhansk Oblast in Ukraine and an oil depot in the Russian-occupied city of Shakhtarsk in Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine. Residents in Saratov reported hearing explosions, and there are photos and videos circulating online that appears to show at least one drone hitting the facility there. You'll find it if you search for it. Now, Vasyl Malyuk, the head of the SBU, Security Service of Ukraine, just to round this bit off, he said on Friday that Ukraine has carried out nearly 160 successful strikes against oil extraction and refining facilities across Russia in this year alone. A couple more from me, Francis. Germany has delivered Patriot air defence systems to Ukraine, honouring promises made just a few weeks ago. So making the announcement last night, President Zelensky said, "We have strengthened the Patriot component of our Ukrainian air defence. I thank Germany and personally Federal Chancellor Friedrich Merz for this joint step to protect human lives from Russian terror. For some time, we've been preparing this reinforcement of our air defence, and now the agreements reached have been implemented." This announcement comes just over a month after German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said that Berlin would provide Ukraine with 2 Patriot systems by the end of the year. Good on you, Germany. Taurus! Anyway, slightly bizarre one to finish, Francis. A Russian Coast Guard patrol boat was spotted on the Narva River. That's in northeast Estonia. It's the border with Russia. Patrol boat there flying the banner of the Russian Wagner mercenary group. This comes from Estonian authorities in a statement yesterday. Now, the Wagner group, you'll remember, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was in charge of that brief march on Moscow in June 2023, which didn't end well. All mutiny, no bounty.
I knew you were going to say it, Dom. I was just waiting.
Boom, boom. June 23, before dying in a mysterious plane crash 2 months later. Yevgeny Prigozhin, obviously getting too close to the sun there. Now, since then, we thought Wagner had moved into or become part of, been subsumed into the main part of Russian military forces, coming under the banner of the Africa Corps. Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, said this flag, it was the flag that was on that patrol boat on the Narva River, this flag stands for barbarism, war crimes and chaos. Its appearance on the EU and NATO borders sums it up perfectly. There is no civilization beyond that point. This is why it is critical to strengthen Ukraine, which is holding the line against Russian lawlessness. Now, slightly less prosaically, Estonia's foreign ministry also issued a statement which said, "We can only speculate whether the spirit of Chef Prigozhin is still alive in Russia. The Wagner crew are once again trying to take Moscow, or have they set their sights on St. Petersburg this time?" A little bit flippant, talking about Prigozhin like that. Anyway, that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let's start with President Trump. President Trump confirmed yesterday, if it was in doubt, that he is not planning to provide Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. When he was asked explicitly by reporters, he responded, "Things can change, but at this moment, I'm not." When asked if there was a final straw that would convince him Putin isn't ready to end the war in Ukraine, he replied, "Sometimes you just have to let them fight," calling the war hard on both sides and claiming Putin may have lost maybe 1 million soldiers. Now, reports circulating over the weekend suggest that the Pentagon had given the green light that American defence capabilities wouldn't have been compromised if he decided to sell Ukraine or its allies some of the US arsenal of Tomahawks, but that Trump and his team had the final decision and made the decision just described. According to Bloomberg, the British government recently resupplied Ukraine with more Storm Shadow cruise missiles instead to ensure Ukraine is stocked ahead of the winter months, during which London is concerned the Kremlin will step up attacks on Ukrainian civilians. Zelensky also said, as Dom just mentioned, that Kyiv has received more Patriot missiles. That really matters given the energy situation I was talking about last week. In other interviews over the weekend, Trump said the same old lines we've become used to, that he has a good relationship with Putin and, quote, wants to trade with us and he wants to make a lot of money for Russia, and I think that's great. That's what I like. I think we're going to get it done. Yeah, I think he really wants to do business with the US. When he was asked who it was harder to negotiate with, Putin or Xi, Trump replied, "Both are complex, both are smart, both are tough, both are very strong leaders who you can't play with." The implication being, of course, that he knows exactly how to handle them. And while some are welcoming the fact that Trump also said he denied Hungary an exemption from US sanctions on Russian oil after Viktor Orban requested it, the Russians are keen to project the idea that they are happy with the way things are, saying there's no need for a meeting between Trump and Putin. Quote, "There is no need for very painstaking work on the details of the peace settlement issue." That came from our old friend Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. Now, whether that is completely true, there is evidence that they do still want that summit to go ahead, is unclear. But it is obvious we are still a long way from what Robert Persson, senior fellow in the Eurasia programme at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, who I interviewed on the pod quite recently, said, which is that an American strategy against Russia would need to skip the carrots and move straight to the sticks, targeting Russian weaknesses, imposing maximum pressure, and shoring up vulnerabilities in the Western coalition's will. I'm not optimistic we will see much, if any, shift, but an interesting commentary piece in the Wall Street Journal by Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project and a former congressional Republican chief of staff, as well as Colby Barrett, who's the producer of A Faith Under Siege, that's a documentary about Russian atrocities against Ukrainian Christians, argues Republican views of President Zelensky have become more favourable in recent months. As they write, in March 2022, 67% of Trump voters viewed Zelensky favourably. But between millions of dollars of Russian disinformation directed against him, Trump's unflattering accusations, and Zelensky's own missteps, that figure dropped to 19% by March 2025. Zelensky's team ignored Trump's voters. Now, Zelensky gives interviews on The Ben Shapiro Show and Newsmax. In August, the Ukrainian president hosted an American-style prayer breakfast in Kyiv, attracting thousands of believers from Ukraine, America, and across the globe. Soon after, the well-liked Trinity Broadcasting Network host Yoel Rosenberg interviewed Zelensky in Kyiv. Now, just as an aside on that, I was at a similar prayer breakfast hosted in Odessa during our recent trip there, which you'll hear on the podcast over the holiday period. Interesting given the context of what I was just saying. The piece goes on. Since June, Ukraine Freedom Project polling has shown a 22-point swing in support for military aid among religious conservatives and an 18-point swing among Republicans who attend church weekly. How can Mr. Zelensky lock in Republicans, keep winning, and talk about winning with conservative media? Only 11% of Republican voters say they think Ukraine is winning because they're told about Ukrainian victories. When given information like this, half of Republicans recognise Ukraine is winning, and 85% of them favour military aid to Ukraine. So if you're listening in America, I'd love to hear if you've noticed a positive shift in Republican perceptions of Ukraine in recent months. And we'll add a link to that piece in the show notes. In other news, top officials from 35 countries will gather in Madrid for a secret private summit of the Coalition of the Willing tomorrow. That's coming from Spanish newspaper El Mundo. They're citing a document that they've obtained. Now, I'd speculate the failure of the EU to agree on utilising the frozen Russian state assets would explain the top agenda for the meeting. But the choice of location is also interesting. Spain did not agree to the new NATO spending targets and was given dispensation to do so by the new NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, who replaced Jens Stoltenberg. Could the choice of location be London and Paris's way of trying to encourage Madrid to do more? But Dom, have you got some thoughts on this?
I have. And I would invite people to listen to Friday's podcast where I expounded on those thoughts and gave that bit of news. You're not going mad, folks. Don't worry. This just proves that beneath the cool exterior that's sometimes described as he's more machine now than man, twisted and evil, there beats a human heart in the soul of Francis Dearnley. When you are off, you are off. Do not listen to the pod. That's what we have to do. That's how we get through this. So I don't blame you for missing my update about the super secret meeting in Madrid on Tuesday. I don't hold it against you that you care so little for my journalism that you didn't ask what I covered last week while you were away. And I'm not going to mention this more than 200 or 300 times. So something better come out of this secret meeting now, the amount of coverage we've given it.
Well, it's the first time, I think, in 3.5 years that we've repeated a story. So apologies for that, folks. But anyway, I still think it's worth us just talking about. And who knows, maybe they missed the episode on Friday because I wasn't there, Dom. They saw in the list that I wasn't on it. I thought, we'll skip that one. We'll just wait until Monday. Anyway, we'll leave that story, but we'll stay with Europe. Turkey's now responding to US sanctions on Russia. 2 of its refineries, according to Reuters, are switching to non-Russian imports. One of the refineries, Sokar, is owned by Azerbaijan, which will come as a particular blow to Moscow given their relations with that country historically. Final story, small one, but one I found quite interesting. As the Telegraph reports, a Russian who jumped from a moving train to escape being sent to war has reportedly been denied asylum in Finland. Independent Russian media outlets say Daniil Mukhabemetev, a 21-year-old who fled Russia, has lodged an appeal with the European Court of Human Rights. But if that is unsuccessful, he could be forced to return to Lithuania, the first EU country he reached, and from there be deported to Russia. Now, for context, in mid-June, Lithuanian police announced that a passenger on a sealed train between the Black Sea resort of Alder and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad had opened a door and jumped from the vehicle. Authorities dispatched a helicopter and police officers with sniffer dogs to search for the fugitive. But after jumping out near a Lithuanian town, he fled to Finland, telling reporters he decided to flee Russia after receiving a summons from a military enlistment office in Moscow, where he was living at the time. The summons meant that he was prohibited from leaving the country. To quote him, "For me, the right choice was to refuse military service, to refuse to take up arms. It hurt me, the invasion, and that we could not stop it or influence it in any way." Now, Finland's refused asylum to 104 Russian citizens between January and September 2025. According to independent outlet Medusa, the Finnish Immigration Service has cited Russian officials saying that mobilization is no longer happening in Russia as a reason for refusing to grant asylum based on avoiding conscription. A Finnish spokesperson said the country is guided by UN rules under which the threat of military service alone does not qualify as grounds for asylum. So that's the story. On the one hand, the Finnish anxiety is understandable for security reasons given the Russian threat and because of the challenges familiar to many European countries around immigration. But purely from a strategic perspective in the context of the war, many will wonder, is this policy wise at a time when Europe could be encouraging Russians who don't want to fight to find ways to escape or to refuse? Those of you who've been with us a long time may remember that the Ukrainians adopted a strategy early on in the war of returning some young captured Russian soldiers to their mothers at the border, seeking to counter Moscow's narratives about the reality of the war and Ukraine. Back then, we discussed how one of the biggest shifts in the First World War within the German army was their decline in fear as to the consequences of surrendering to British, French and American forces the longer the war went on, which played a pivotal role in the collapse of the German military on the Western Front after the failed offensives in 1918. There may be a lesson there. You want to encourage the enemy to flee, not punish them for not fighting. And a question for Ukraine and its allies is, are they doing that? As ever, very interested to hear your thoughts on this. But let's turn now to our special segment, a deep dive into a new film about the war, interwoven with a short interview I recorded with Jens Stoltenberg, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who served as NATO Secretary General from 2014 to 2024. The documentary, Facing War, follows the final 2 years of Stoltenberg's leadership of the alliance, a period marked by some of the most delicate moments in NATO's history. Norwegian filmmaker Tommy Gulliksen was given unprecedented access to Stoltenberg during that time, capturing the tension and humanity behind the key decisions. Tommy, a long-time listener of this podcast, weaves in clips from the show to add historical texture to the events. Here are a few excerpts from the trailer.
I'm here today with a simple message. NATO stands with you today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
We're with you for as long as it takes does not bring one round of ammunition.
The strategic situation right now, sir, is they're losing.
Because I think Zelensky was very calm in the way he behaved.
No, I don't think so, sir. I definitely sensed panic.
They're asking for anything and everything right now.
They need help. We need to deliver some air defense over here pretty quickly.
NATO allies have not delivered what they promised.
President Zelensky expressing frustration over the hold-up on US weapon supplies.
They are fighting our war.
Does this represent a failure from NATO allies?
That should obviously be that Ukraine wins. My president has used this terrible phrase that we're with you for as long as it takes. That is an empty statement that does not bring one round of ammunition.
I think a lot of European and Western leaders know that deep down, but they are reluctant to follow the next step, which is going all in supporting Ukraine.
And for me it's a tragedy because they are fighting a war to defend democracy in Europe. And there's no Western boots on the ground. They are fighting our war.
At the end of the day, it's in our hands. All it takes sometimes is somebody in the right place, at the right time, saying the right things. And everything can change. I was kindly invited to attend the London premiere of the film, followed by a gathering at the Norwegian ambassador's residence, the house that sheltered Norway's government in exile during the Second World War. There, in the old library, I was able to sit down with Mr. Stoltenberg and ask some of the questions I've long wanted to put to him, including what his own reflections on that critical period are. The film has many moments of triumph for you, but also frustrations because of the failures around voluntary weapons donations to Ukraine. What other regrets do you have from your time as Secretary General relating to the war?
Well, first of all, NATO allies have provided unprecedented military support to Ukraine, and we actually were able to establish a much firmer framework for that support at the NATO summit in Washington in July last year, 2024. But the biggest mistake we made as an alliance and NATO allies made was that in the years following the illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's first intervention into East Donbass in 2014, we didn't arm the Ukrainians. We should have provided much more military support in those 8 years leading up to 2022. And if we had done that, I think that at least the Ukrainians would have been in a much stronger position today, and Russia would have controlled much less land territory. But at best, it could actually have prevented the Russian full-scale invasion if Ukraine had been more armed and better equipped to deter Russian aggression in 2022.
You managed to persuade many NATO countries to increase their defence spending. In your experience, how might the 1.5 commitment to defence-related spending lead to bad practices by some member states?
Well, I think The core commitment is, of course, to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense. Then it's the 1.5% of GDP for defense-related purposes, infrastructure. That's harder, of course, to measure, and I will not, as a former Secretary General NATO, go into the technical details of that. But of course, to have the roads, to have the airports, also for civilian infrastructure, also to underpin support military efforts is important. But it goes without saying that it's a bit harder to measure as precise as core defense spending.
After spending months inside NATO and gathering countless hours of footage, Tommy gained an extraordinary vantage point, seeing the machinery of the alliance up close. But before hearing Tommy's insights into NATO's strengths and shortcomings, I wanted to start with something simpler. Just how monumental a task was it to capture all of that on film?
Yeah, so we began filming in January 23. And then he had only 10 months left of his tenure. So we were facing 10 months following him and his advisors. And then, of course, he was extended and then I was extended. So it became 22 months. And I think we visited in the first year 25 countries. The second year we did 27 countries. So I think it was 40, 50 presidential palaces, prime minister's offices, and it all ended up in, I think, around 600 hours of footage.
It's an enormous undertaking. How do you even begin to process that material? Did you know the story that you wanted to tell, or was this something that you wanted to see what you got and then recalibrate from that?
Like in the beginning, you're just fumbling in the dark. And you're just trying to understand how this universe works. They don't sit down with you and explain to you this is how it works, and you have to learn on the job. And in the beginning, I was very focused on what was happening at the front in Ukraine, and I was listening to your podcast a lot to keep informed. And in the beginning, I felt that the story was very connected to what was happening at the front. But after a while, I realized that it had to have some timeless qualities. That news, it changes a lot, and the film has to convey something different. It has to be about something different.
And what do you think that is? And I know that's a tricky question to ask someone who's involved in creative work, who's in a sense an artist. But did you have an idea and a philosophy that you wanted to project in this film?
So you could easily take this film into different directions. It could be the film about NATO, the one big film about NATO, an informational piece. You could make it about the war in Ukraine, or you can make it even about Jens Stoltenberg. But after a while, we understood that this is a film about diplomacy. It's about how leaders and human beings come together and find solutions and compromises and a way to move forward when it's needed the most.
Joe Barnes, you're in Brussels covering NATO's 75th birthday. Were any slices of cake for you?
Yes, Jens Stoltenberg and various foreign ministers did cut a cake today and to mark the moment. But actually, if you take a step back, we're looking at doubts. Is NATO doing enough to help Ukraine? It's not a positive and joyous mood in Brussels for Ukraine at the moment.
Did you feel that NATO passed the stress test that it was put under? Or did you leave, having been in the room, and we'll get to that in a moment, for so long, that this was a succeeding organisation? Or did you feel that you perhaps were recording something that was failing and potentially even in its death throes?
I remember being in the first NATO summit, and I was in a room with all the leaders. And in the beginning, you're a bit power-struck, to be honest. And then it's kind of paranoia also kicks in because you realize that these are the responsible people in the world. There are no other grown-ups. And after a while, I kind of felt that it was a family, although a very dysfunctional family. And that might scare you. This is a very dysfunctional group of people. But then you just realize that most families are dysfunctional. And the reason why you're a family is that you're able to stick together, even though you have personal differences. You have different personalities and agendas, and you have history going back, but you're still able to meet at Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever. And that's what makes you a family. And I think family values are really important to keep in mind, because it's the thing that unites us when the rest of the world is run by interests, and sometimes short-term interests. And to me, that actually is what I find hope.
Because in a way, you're repudiating one of the arguments that's often made about foreign affairs, which is that countries don't have relationships, they only have interests. But the film really does underscore sometimes the personal favours that diplomats and leaders are willing to do for Mr. Stoltenberg or indeed for other nations. And the access is extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. How did you get that access? And at what point did you go from being somebody who people were obviously aware was there and they were watching their words, particularly Mr. Stoltenberg, to them just being incredibly open with you?
So we had an agreement with NATO, which I call the impossible agreement, where for them to give away the final cut, we would have that. They would allow us access, but not be able to control the end product. And I think that was only possible because of a leap of faith, and they had trust in us, and they saw it as a transparency project. Once we had that, we had access to the room. But then it's something completely different to have access to the conversations between the leaders, because that is very intimate. And sometimes even their chief of staffs are not allowed. And to have the camera in there, it's just that took me a long time to understand how I could, when to move in and how close I could get. It felt like filming animals in a way, just like a nature documentary. How close can you get and when is the right time? But I always knew that that was the X factor, that was the value, because we want to know how Stoltenberg talks to Zelensky or Erdogan or Urban, because this is how top level diplomacy is actually playing out. And this is how they solve these extremely difficult issues. I think it's also like important to understand that they would have like sometimes 5-10 minutes before they would sit down in North Atlantic Council. And they would just sometimes small talk. But these small pockets are extremely important to leaders because they can go to another leader and address an issue. And we might think that these leaders, they meet all the time and they have this great relationship, but they don't. Like for one leader to have access to another one, that might take months for their teams to set up. And just to talk tete-a-tete and solve things is extremely valuable to, of course, nations, but also alliances. And this is the part of the diplomacy that I wanted to portray, that we chose these leaders for a reason. And sometimes they're able to solve what the systems might spend half a year or a year solving.
Yeah, there's a remarkable moment in the film where Jens Stoltenberg dashes over to the Hungarians and basically persuades them at that moment not to be barriers to the NATO mission that he's trying to get started during his tenure, which before that had been rejected. If we fail now, you know, this is going to be something that's going to drag on for months and months, and Ukraine needs this at this moment. And it just speaks to what you're saying, which is that if it hadn't been for him being able to have that very quick conversation, then maybe history would have been very different on that issue particularly. On that theme, did you feel when you were hearing, whether it be the advisors, whether it be the leaders themselves talking about the issues, whether it be relating to Ukraine or otherwise, did you feel that they were vastly better informed on matters than, say, we are ordinary civilians, journalists? Or did you feel that actually they were, you described them as a family, that they had the same foibles as most families do, which is they have blind spots and they may not actually be across all of the detail?
So I think we all want our leaders to be superhumans and to know everything about, you know, every area of society, but they don't. They have very limited time and attention. There are two things I experienced. One is that Stoltenberg's speaking points, that how he would address the public in his speeches and press conferences, would be very similar to how he would address leaders in tete-a-tetes. And also the other thing, when I was observing over a lot of meetings, is that the information they would have about what was happening at the front and what was happening in Ukraine was very similar to what the media coverage would supply the public with. So I listened to your podcast every day to keep informed. That was just like my prepare, and it became also part of my daily routine that I enjoyed. But I sometimes felt that I was more informed than people in meetings, and even Stoltenberg himself.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, no, terrifying, but also a good thing in a way. But because I think now the public has access to what's happening.
Right. Yes, because in the past, that kind of information would have taken weeks to filter through and only leaders at the top would have known, whilst now we can all be part of the democratic conversation.
We can. And why we have those leaders is that we want them to be able to agree. We want them to reach consensus. And I think, like, especially for a lot of Norwegians, when we have the Secretary General of NATO and when you see what's happening in Ukraine, people say, why aren't NATO doing more? Why aren't Stoltenberg doing more? But he's not able to move, forces with a joystick. He can't do whatever he wants. He can only do what 32 nations agree to do. And if he cannot reach consensus, they have nothing. And that is like the very fascinating setup, is that if you have an effective Secretary General who is able to set out goals that are not too high and not too low, you're able to actually move forward. But you can very easily end up with the common lowest denominator being 0. Or if you set your goals too high, you won't reach consensus, you also have 0. And then NATO will become obsolete. And that's also the fascinating stakes with a consensus-based organization. I also felt like he spent so much of his time with the nations, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, Turkey. But that's also how a teacher addresses the class. Like, you have some children with behavioral disorders, and you spend so much more time on them than did the students that show up on time, do their homework, and raise their hand before they talk. But you spend your time with the people with these behavioral disorders because that benefits the whole class. In the big picture, in the end, that's how you move forward, and it benefits everyone. And that's how I often see Stoltenberg's position and his purpose and his role.
Now, you were saying that something that's been quite striking as you've been going around Europe and doing the premieres has been the ways that the film has been received. Can you tell me about that? How have different populations perceived this film and what it's saying?
Already, when I moved around in the world, especially in Europe with Stoltenberg, I felt that NATO and the war in Ukraine was being perceived very differently in the West and the East. And also when I travel with the film and I do Q&As and I meet people, that's being like enforced. And as a child and a youth that grew up in the Western Europe in the 90s, I think I grew up without being really reflecting on why my society was so free and lovely. What were the conditions that allowed it to become free and safe? And I think after a while you forget it. And it's also a good thing that young people forget it and take it for granted. And they focus on other stuff. Go east, especially like I remember like speaking to a filmmaker from Georgia. And I was in Spain and I felt that the crowd in the Q&As and they were kind of taking EU and NATO for granted. And they were like, what's the use of it? And what's the use of the war in Ukraine? And she was like really, really, really provoked by that. And she said we would sacrifice our right arm for a membership. Because at the moment we don't have the privilege to choose our path and our future. And that's something that has always been a humbling experience for me to go around in Europe, because I realized that I grew up also with the same ignorance, that to gain democracy, to gain freedom, the freedom of speech, everything, that price is paid in blood by a generation, like it's done in Sudan at the moment or will be in Tehran. And to maintain that peace has a very low cost. But at some point, probably the young will also feel that that cost is too high. And then you might lose the privilege. And to regain it will be extremely costly. And that price will be paid in blood. And this is probably how the circle of it. And I think that is also why it's important to keep the youth reminded that we probably need some sort of hard tools to keep the soft values protected. And nobody likes insurance. Like, it's so boring and it's the worst kind of money that you spend. And you want to spend as little as possible. But when the neighbor's house is on fire and your wooden house is the next, then insurance probably is the most important thing in the world. And I've experienced that because I was in Denmark. We had our premiere in Denmark right after Trump had threatened to take Greenland. And then the next house, almost part of their own house, was on fire. And the young people, they turned out, like we had 27 sold-out screenings in Copenhagen. So many people turned out because it mattered the most. And it's a very rude awakening, and it's happening at the moment. And I just felt that it's been really interesting to go around and see some countries that are still kind of in this state of ignorance, and other parts of Western Europe that has woken up.
So Tommy's view of NATO, its purpose, its growing challenges, is clear. But does Stoltenberg see it in the same way? What is the biggest challenge for NATO and the West at this moment of the war?
Is to maintain our unity in providing long-term military support to Ukraine. Because NATO allies, we represent 50% of the world's economic might, 50% of the world's military might, and as long as we stand together and as long as we are committed to support Ukraine, we can be able to support them with enough military support so they can make sure that Putin understands that he will not win on the battlefield and has to sit down and agree a peaceful solution to the war where Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation.
I think one of the other really commendable things about the film is that it doesn't just focus on the world leaders and on Jens. It focuses on the advisors. It focuses on, in a way, the security guards, the people who give you that access and are playing pivotal roles as well. Can you tell us the story you told at the beginning of the premiere about how you managed to win the trust of some of those gatekeepers?
So in the political world, it's easy that you kind of think of the advisors and the chief of staff. They are the one who will grant you access to the leaders. But there are some permissions that you never ask for because it can never be granted. For example, going very close to a leader with a camera. So the ones you have to deal with are the bodyguards because they are the gatekeepers. They are the physical responsibility of the leaders. And I understood that they are the people that I need to mirror them. So I shaved my head, I changed my appearance, I would dress like them, I would move like them, I would try to copy every movement. And I would flirt with them, I would touch them like the leaders do. And sometimes I had 5 seconds to make them allow me getting close to their leader, which they're really not should be allowing. And that was a part of the dance and the game. And I think that was a key part to my success, being able to move so freely and be so close with the camera, is that you understand the people around them. So it was diplomacy in just another field. But I learned a lot from studying Stoltenberg, how you gain the trust of people in only a matter of seconds.
Tommy didn't just witness the unseen work of NATO's backroom players. He brings them to the forefront. This next moment, filmed aboard a Ukrainian train after meeting President Zelensky, shows how Stoltenberg's advisors both guide and steady the NATO chief as events unfold around him.
I think the other thing I noticed in her today, and Tom said it, I definitely sensed panic.
You sense panic?
I do.
Because I think Zelensky was very calm in the way he behaved.
No, I don't think so. I think he was twitchy. I think he couldn't stay focused. I think they need help. We need to deliver some air defense over here pretty quickly. I really believe that.
Their tasks are starting to get more random, which is an indication of how bad the situation is on the ground, quite frankly.
What do you mean by that?
The calmer you are, the more rational your requests are. They're asking for anything and everything right now.
You said you had the permission to produce the final cut as you wanted, but was there anything that you needed to censor for security reasons?
So NATO had of course, a clause that was about security issues. In the end, I think the only discussion we had was a phone in the Secretary General's office, which leads directly to the Oval Office. And they didn't want the specifics and the make of that one being out in the public. So we blurred that one. I hope it's still there. I hope it still leads to the Oval Office because we need that right now.
Interesting. You, as you say, have produced 600 hours worth of footage. This is, of course, only, I think, 104 minutes of that. And there's a mini-series as well, which shows a little bit more information. But I wonder what's going to happen to that footage for future historians. Where is it now?
So it will be stored in the NATO archives, so it will be nuclear safe, and we will have the encryption keys. We don't know in the future what will be significant, and I think that's a part of the beauty of documenting your present tense. You don't know how the future generation will look back at it and how things might change, and that's kind of always what's motivating me. Like I've been filming so many meetings and I've been to so many places that I felt were irrelevant and it will never ever end up in the final cut. But I don't know, in 50 years, it might matter. Keeps you going on and stay focused and working. And I think that's also like the privilege and also the responsibility of a documentary filmmaker is to capture your times, reflect your times, and then store it. And then it will be valuable to the future generations.
Facing War is a rare, intimate and gripping look at diplomacy under fire. with universal lessons that transcend the historical moments it records. It's currently showing in cinemas around the world, and we'll add a link in the show notes to the film's website. There is also a longer version, which has been turned into a television series. That is also being shown in multiple countries in Europe. But I leave you with Mr. Stoltenberg, the man at the eye of the storm. I wanted to ask him, what is his read of Vladimir Putin? You first spoke to Vladimir Putin in the year 2000. When you reflect on your relationship with him over the decades, how has it changed and what kind of man do you think he is?
Well, what I have seen is that at least he has changed his behavior. When I first met him in 2000, I was a newly elected Prime Minister of Norway. He was a newly elected President of Russia, and we were able to work together on many issues. And Russia gradually actually improved its relationship not only with Norway, but with the wider West. Then it gradually started to move in the wrong direction. Georgia in 2008, and later, of course, Ukraine in 2014, and everything that happened since then. So instead of trying to analyze too much the psycho of President Putin, I think it's more important to actually see what he does. And he is now responsible for aggressive use of military force against a neighbor, and we need to react to that.
But let's turn to our final thoughts now. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners?
Oh, thanks, Francis. Now, I want to pick up on a comment that you made earlier. You were talking about Donald Trump and his interview on Air Force One. I've seen some footage on that. And as you say, when he was asked about what would be the last straw for the United States regarding Russia's actions in Ukraine, he said, there is no last straw. As you said, there is no last straw. And then he went on a little bit later and he said, sometimes you just have to let events unfold. Now, interestingly, Megan Mobbs has offered the comment there about that, saying a strong America doesn't let events unfold. We dictate them. She does say that POTUS's, as in President of the United States, POTUS's sanctions are biting, but more is needed. Putin is dug in and only responds to sustained, credible strength. But it was her comment about a strong America doesn't let events unfold, we dictate them. I thought that was very interesting. It might have been a misstep by Donald Trump to use that kind of language. I don't think he'd really care. But I'd be interested in your thoughts. Where are you on the swingometer of events? Should the US be allowing things to unfold? Should America move to lead the free world once again? Or just let events unfold and react accordingly? Be interested in your thoughts. We're giving quite a lot of homework today. You've asked folks for comments about how Zelensky's going down in the US.
We love to hear from people. What can we say?
We do.
And as ever, go for the newsletter if you want to read our answers to your questions. And we are encouraging people now to send in clips of the questions if you so wish. So you can send in 20 seconds, your first name, where you're from, and then your question. And we'll play it on the pod. May not be this week, might be week after or something like that. We'll play it on the pod. You'll hear the questions, you'll hear your own voice, and then we'll answer them in the newsletter. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.